Hi, today we're going to be talking about temperature regulation. This comes from chapter 12 in the Powers textbook. It would be really helpful to read through the chapter, study it, and know everything you can. I'm going to take you through some of the major points today, but remember, just as always, you'll be responsible for things that are in the textbook that I may not cover during these lectures. By way of outline, we'll start talking about why the body regulates its temperature so tightly. Then we'll talk about the major sources of heat production and heat loss. And we'll wrap it up by briefly talking about the mechanisms for sensing and regulating body temperature. Alright, so why do we need to know about temperature regulation? Why is it important? Why does the body regulate the body temperature so much? Well, let's think about all the different situations in which we exercise. First of all, exercise itself generates a lot of heat. If you remember from metabolism, it's only about 20 to 30% of our metabolism actually goes towards making ATP. The rest of it goes towards generating heat. So by far, our biggest product of exercise is heat. We have to know what to do with that. Also, we exercise in extreme environments. This is my son Eli when we went sledding at Sugar House Park in Salt Lake. It's cold, right? We have to know how the body regulates during cold so we can perform well during in the cold. This is me and my boys down in Las Vegas, or better said Boulder City. We're near the Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam in Las Vegas. It's hot down there. I used to run cross country in Las Vegas, and holy moly, you have to know a lot about temperature regulation down there. You do a lot of sweating, there's a lot of heat, and so if we know how temperature affects physical performance, then we're going to be better off for it. Not only in terms of exercise, but just a lot of jobs take us and make us work in extreme environments. Some of the most extreme being like working in different factories, like where you smelt metal. You got huge flames going around. You're working in these huge suits that definitely are not going to be friendly to evaporating sweat, so you'll get pretty hot. Other instances where temperature regulation is really important. Think about all the servicemen and women that go off to different parts of the world. Some are working in extreme heat, others are working in extreme cold. There's a big incentive to know how the body works in these different climates so that they can perform well and do their jobs well and not get hurt. So there's a lot of reasons to study it. Because, let's face it, we operate in a lot of different temperatures. Despite working in so many different temperatures, we're pretty good at maintaining a constant body temperature. And that can be called, or we can be called homeotherms for maintaining a fairly constant internal body temperature or core temperature. So why is it important to regulate it so tightly? If you remember back when we talked about bioenergetics, enzyme activity itself is affected by body temperature. Normally we're sitting somewhere around here in the optimal levels. If we get too hot or too cold, our enzymes won't work and our systems will shut down, and it can work in suboptimal performance, illness, and even death. So it's important for the body to be able to regulate temperature well. So that's why we're going to study this. Now let's go in and talk about some of the major mechanisms for heat production and heat loss. When we talk about heat production and heat loss, you need to think of it as having an in and an out, right? So the metaphor I draw is with a bathtub. If you want to fill up a bathtub to the level that's just right, you can either adjust how much water goes in or how much water goes out the drain, right? So what we're focusing on right now is how much water goes in from the heat, from heat production. And remember, we want to keep it at the right levels. If we have too much water coming in, we're accumulating too much heat, it can get too high and we can have our system shut down. If we don't have enough heat going in and it's draining too fast, or the heat's just not coming out of the spigot fast enough, we'll be in trouble as well. So how do we generate heat in our bodies? And now remember, the major mechanism is just with muscle work and metabolism. Whenever we're breaking down ATP, whenever we're synthesizing ATP, we're generating heat. It's the major byproduct of metabolism, even more than ATP, right? Aerobic metabolism somewhere around 30% efficient, meaning that the rest of that, the energy from metabolism, is really going towards heat. So what determines how much heat is produced during exercise is how much work's being performed and the efficiency of the metabolism, and our body can modulate both of these factors. If we look at this graph, it shows temperature. It's rectal temperature, and so in exercise physiology, one of the ways they measure temperature is by putting a rectal probe thermometer in the rectum to get an idea of core temperature. Not really the most comfortable thing. It's not terrible, but there are definitely different ways to do it now. This is kind of a classic measure. Now you can swallow a pill that has a thermometer on it. It just goes into your intestines, or you could just take something down your esophagus as well. But nevertheless, this is just basically rectal temperature is an analog for core temperature. So you can see as O2 uptake, or VO2, increases, the harder you work, whether you're doing arm or leg exercise, rectal temperature or core temperature increases. So the amount of heat we generate is proportional and directly dependent on how much work we're doing. Now that work can be voluntary or involuntary. So exercise would be voluntary, but there are times when we're not exercising that our body tries to increase how much work we're doing to generate heat, right? Shivering is an example of involuntary exercise. And the idea of shivering is that you increase muscle metabolism, generate more heat, and hopefully warm yourself up. Shivering itself can increase heat production at rest by 5 times. So it's definitely an effective mechanism of generating heat. The next way we can modulate how much heat is being produced is by the efficiency of our metabolism. So if you remember back to when we talked about the electron transport chain, we have a thing called an uncoupling protein. And the uncoupling proteins allow the hydrogen ions to flow down the gradient from the intermembrane space to the mitochondrial matrix without going down ATP synthase. So we're getting hydrogen ions flowing down, no ATP production. We're using all this oxygen to get these hydrogens up here. We're burning a lot of things, creating a lot of heat just to get these hydrogen ions to go down the uncoupling protein. And so this is a way to modulate how much heat you generate. You have in your body things called brown and beige adipose tissue. This is fat that has a little bit of extra mitochondria in it. You have a lot more when you're a baby, but some stays around as you age. And the idea with this is that it has a lot of mitochondria, a lot of uncoupling protein, and so you can generate heat when you're cold. Signals like thyroxine or other signals stimulate the uncoupling protein, get more into the mitochondria so that you are less efficient and you're burning more calories, generating more heat for a given amount of ATP production. Interestingly, this brown fat and the uncoupling protein is also potentially a way to affect just fat metabolism and body composition. People are looking into it as like a dietary therapy. If you can increase uncoupling, that would increase your resting metabolic rate. You'd have to consume more oxygen, burn more calories to get the same amount of ATP. So maybe in a couple of years you'll see some more details about uncoupling protein and weight loss, but right now it's not looking that effective, but we'll see. And what about the ways that heat is lost? So we've talked about how heat is produced, right? And now we're going to look at how the body drains the heat and adjusts it. So there's a couple of things that we can do to adjust heat loss. And their main 4 are conduction, radiation, convection, and evaporation. This diagram over here is something that you should study and make sure that you can describe what's going on. Hopefully by the end of the lecture you'll understand all these things that are going on, but it just describes where heat is coming from in exercise and how it's dissipated. So the 4 mechanisms of heat loss. First is conduction, and conduction is when energy is exchanged between 2 surfaces that are in contact. So the classic example is sitting on one of those metal chairs in church. You warm it up, right? Or if it's really cold, it takes all the heat out of you. even though it seems to do a lot during sacrament meeting, it really doesn't do much for you during exercise. Conduction isn't a major way of heat loss during exercise. The next one, radiation, is a little more meaningful. Radiation is the exchange of energy or heat from one surface to another without them being in contact. The example of this is how the sun heats the earth, right? It's not in contact, but the heat is able to come and heat the earth. Now what's important about this is if it's hot outside, or you're in a hot environment, that heat can actually enter into you and heat you up instead of you heating the environment up, as was the case with the chair usually. Right? So if you're in a hot environment, it can heat you up. This is an important factor with exercise, but certainly not the most important factor. The next one, convection, is also important. This is how heat is transferred from one object to another by the circulation of heated molecules. Think about just a fan blowing air past you. This is what convection is. It takes the hot molecules, hot air away from you and replaces it with cool air. And this is certainly at play during exercise. It's not the most influential, but it's at play. And then the final one is evaporation. And by far, evaporation is the most influential and most important for heat loss during exercise. Evaporation is a heat-induced change in water from a liquid to vapor form, which results in the removal of heat. Now keep in mind this occurs even at rest. Just sitting here listening to this video, you might be sweating to control your body temperature. And another important thing to understand is that vapor pressure is highly influential of how much you can sweat and evaporate sweat. So how sweating works is you have these sweat glands in your skin, and they secrete sweat or little droplets of water with salt and other things in them out onto the surface of your skin. Within your skin you have blood, and that blood it's been circulating from your muscles where they're generating all the heat, going to your core, getting more heat, and now it finally comes out to the skin and transmits that heat through the skin, and it goes onto the sweat droplets. Once the sweat droplets get hot enough, they turn to a vapor and evaporate or get off of the skin and take the heat with them. So this is how the majority of your heat is lost during exercise, by sweating. If you do anything during exercise to minimize your sweating, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be accumulating more heat than you normally would. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about what influences the evaporation of sweat, and then we'll pick up from there.